Welcome to EdRising Hangouts. My name is Grace Worm, and I'm a proud young educator with a lot of questions. I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, where I went through the You Teach Liberal Arts Teacher Preparation Program. I was also in Road Trip Nation's documentary, The Road to Teach. Recently, I was out in Utah teaching outdoor education for the National Park Service, and right now I am studying for a Master's in Literature at Trinity College, Dublin. Today's episode is Connecting with Students and Cultural Competence, and it should be a great discussion if you're interested in trying to figure out how to become a high-impact teacher. Please tweet your questions and thoughts during the Hangout using the hashtag EdRisingChat. Joining us is Ashley Kincaid. She is co-director of Educators Rising. Hello, Ashley.
Hello.
Hi. And the star of our show today is Jose Vilson, a teacher with many titles and achievements, including author, blogger, social justice activist, and founder of Educolor. But first and foremost, he is a middle school math teacher from New York City. Follow him on Twitter with the handle TheJLV. Jose, thank you so much for joining us on EdRising Hangouts.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's an honor, really, to have you here, and your resume is pretty chock full of amazing work. Can you just go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit more for our audience?
My name is Jose Vilson. I teach math to 8th graders in Washington Heights, New York City, and I've been doing this for 10 years. It's my 11th year now. I'm a full-time teacher, but I also do a lot of writing, activism, and just generally speaking up and out about the education profession, trying to get people inspired to become teachers in their own right, but also trying to challenge my colleagues to become better teachers through the ideas of cultural competence.
Okay, and can you start out by kind of explaining that term a little bit more for you? What does cultural competence mean for you?
When I hear the term cultural competence, I'd like to start out by saying that cultural proficiency is, cultural competence is professional competence, meaning how do you actually get to know the students not just as numbers on a paper or as an ID number, but as actual students who live and breathe in your classroom. And one of the biggest ways you can do that is by getting to know them through racial and cultural lenses. I think oftentimes in education, we strip those identities because it's safer for us to do that. So if we really want to get to know students, a lot of what we have to do is get to know their backgrounds, their cultures, and who they generally are as people.
Okay. So when our audience today is mostly, teenagers, young people who are considering going into the profession of teaching, so what do they need to keep in mind about cultural competence as they're, taking this step to start training to become an educator?
I think as they start becoming teachers and learning how to be teachers, one of the biggest takeaways they should have is that you're really trying to find out not just how to teach, period. You're learning how to teach kids, and we're learning how to teach human beings and what we would say the future of America. So when we think about the folks that we're going to influence, we have to be prepared to teach students who may or may not look like us, who may or may not have the same values, who don't have the same cultures, but that are equally human and equally capable of succeeding. And I think that's a big part of the job that we have now, is to really try to get a sense of not just who they are as students, who they are academically, but how can we make better people so we can become a better society overall.
Definitely. And along that thread of getting to know your students better, can you tell us why you first became interested in teaching, how you became a teacher?
I became a teacher, the funny reason I tell people is because I didn't want to be a code monkey. I had watched Office Space in high school. I think it was actually in college, and I just didn't want to be throwing printers in the back of my office building and pummeling them down. But I think that speaks to a larger frustration of knowing that maybe your work is meaningless. And so I found myself at a crossroads thinking, how could I be someone who's influential, who gives back to the community, and who can do so with some sort of sustainability? Because oftentimes those of us who go into anything that's like philanthropic or in the public service know that we have to take lower wages as a result. So I became a teacher because I really thought that I could do better than a lot of my teachers who taught me math. But I also thought that I could pass some of the favors forward that were granted to me. And so, I became a graduate of Syracuse University. I got my master's, and I couldn't have done it without my teachers. And I said, well, if I can be the one who passes that on to people who didn't have that my same fortune or the same opportunities I did, then I think there's at least 30 more students who would be in better shape as a result.
Yeah, definitely. And then, so you're in the classroom and teaching, and you're touching, all these lives and making such an impact. How did you go from that to wanting to become a writer, wanting to speak out about things within the education system?
I think a lot of that probably had to do with looking at bookshelves and Barnes and Nobles, for example, Barnes and Noble, right, and trying to figure out what my niche would be, right? So I had always wanted to be a writer of some nature. I just didn't know what I was going to write about, and I just saw that the more books started coming out, the less of those spoke to me and my experiences and the things that I thought would resonate with people in my profession. I often kept looking at books and books on books. You'd have an education professor here, a business leader here, some person who just took education on as a fancy and not really invested in it, just decided to write a book on it. And now, we can all be happy for them, and that's cool. But then one of the teachers got to speak up ourselves, and I think when I first started writing, I really just wanted to reflect on the things that I was doing. But as a result, since I was one of the few who was doing it early on, I started to see that other people wanted to do that sort of thing, and then it became like, okay, Jose, you're going to start talking to people now, not just reflecting about your own piece. And I think nowadays my writing has evolved into a thing where I can speak up and out about issues. But it really did start from this idea of no one else is really doing this like this, and I needed to do it in a way that emphasized how difficult yet how lovely our profession is.
Well, and you often write about, challenging education leaders or challenges within the system. So, you've already kind of touched on this, but why is it so important for you to be out there writing and speaking about education, alongside being a teacher? What have you found as you've started to speak out, why it's so important for you to continue doing it?
I think what I noticed early on was that the more that I kept teaching, the more that the teaching itself didn't resonate with the policymakers. So you always have a new policy coming out every year or so, or some new initiative that was being taken on by central offices or by the principal's office or just nationwide. And there was such a sharp disconnect between what was happening in our classrooms and what was happening in the policy world that I started to see that I needed to find a way to vocalize that. And some of the venues that were offered to us weren't always accessible, right? So you could become, let's say, a chapter leader in your union, or you could become part of an advocacy group. And, all these venues are great, and they may work for some people, but there's others of us who are just like, well, we kind of need to push those boundaries a little more. Like, we don't just want a lot of people in the middle. We want to be able to talk directly to policymakers, to politicians, to education research type folks, the folks who are influencing policy, and we wanted to have a seat at the table. And if we can't have a seat at the table, then we need to create a whole new table, because the practitioners aren't getting any meals off of the current table that we have currently. And so I keep trying to inspire people to advocate, because that disconnect between what's happening in policy and what's happening in practice isn't just because teachers are resistant to whatever the policymakers are making. It's more that there isn't that interchange between what the teachers are saying and what the policymakers are creating. If we had a better exchange in ideals, then we can probably come up with a better solution. But until then, we're going to keep having these battles, and I see myself at the forefront of a lot of those battles.
And are you seeing that you're receiving feedback through your writing? Are you seeing this impact that you've been looking for?
Well, definitely. I think some of it is a little bit more daunting than others. I mean, when I first started doing this, I got a little bit of feedback, but there would be times when teachers would whisper to my principal about what I was writing about, what I was saying, even though I wasn't talking about the school itself. And then there are times when, I would get blocked by my central offices. I mean, can you imagine just one blogger getting blocked by the largest school district in the nation just because I have an opinion? Well, that's exactly what happened a good, I believe, 6 years ago now, 7 years ago now, when I first tried to log into my website off a central DOE computer. Now, of course, what's also interesting about that is that at the same time, people within the central district offices were saying that, in fact, my website was constantly read by the people who were downtown. It's just that everywhere else that you go to a NYC schools computer, for example, you try to log into my website, you couldn't do it because it was blocked all over the place. So I kind of knew I was ticking people off, and that resonated well for me. But I guess with that, you also have this idea of hope, right? So I'm able to turn some of that negative energy into positive because now it's like, okay, maybe he does have something to say. And I've been able to meet some of the bigger people in education policy, Arnie Duncan, if you will, Linda Darling-Hammond, who I'm sure some of the audience is familiar with. Anybody who you can name, I've had at least some sort of contact with, and I've been blessed to have those conversations with them. The idea of teacher leadership has come to the fore, and I can claim a small part of that, but the cultural competence piece has become such a big part of our national narrative, and again, I'm also blessed to be part of that narrative as well.
Grace, I'd love to jump in and ask a question.
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
This is so fascinating. We're all about really empowering these rising educators that are part of the movement to have voices so that they can be advocates for issues that are really important to them. And the issue that's really important to you, or that you've done a lot of speaking and writing on, is this idea of cultural competence, which you were just tying it all back to. I guess I just wanted to ask a follow-up question around cultural competence. You kind of talked about what it is, but in your opinion, why does it matter? Why do teachers need to be culturally competent to be effective? How does it actually help you be a better teacher or help your students learn?
Well, I think it's twofold. I'll start with the national narrative. I mean, you look at some of the incidents that are happening, whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Renisha McBride, and you start seeing that a lot of the students who would be, I guess, victims of police brutality would fall under our guise, right? So we would be the teachers of these students. And if they are school-aged children, then that would generally affect a teacher's job, or specifically those teachers' jobs. And then, of course, you look at what happened in South Carolina, too, where there was school staff who weren't able to handle their students, so they were bringing in school resource officers to handle the situation rather violently. And even Arnie Duncan, who I challenged on this on Twitter, replied back to me that, yes, it was handled inappropriately. So these are things that you have to think about from a national perspective, but also just for me generally, specifically, I find that if I can tap into students in a way that resonates with what they believe in their cultures, if I'm able to tap into the things that they know, the things that they feel, to the things that they're experiencing around them, and really try to translate the material that I'm teaching into something that they can fully embrace, then they tend to gravitate more towards it and actually have I guess a sort of feeling of ownership or possession of the material in front of them. If they feel like it's a part of them, then it becomes natural for them, and they feel confident in the material. And that's always been my push. And it's not to say that it's a perfect solution, but I think it's a lot better than us not trying to work with their person, whoever they are. If we don't know who they are as people, then we're not really teaching students. We're teaching, I guess, tabula rasas. We're teaching blank slates, and I don't think that's the case at all. We should be teaching to students.
And so if I'm a young teacher who's in the classroom, and perhaps I'm not from that community, or if I'm any teacher, how do you seek these things out? How can you find this information about your students within the classroom and things like that?
One of the things that's a great question, because at this point there is such a large disconnect between the current teaching profession and our students. I mean, our students are for the first time mostly of color. We're about 51% students of color throughout the nation, and yet our teaching profession is about 75% white. And of course, there is that disconnect. Having said that, the people who I've seen be the best at the job that they do have lots of conversations, and they try to listen a lot, and they really get involved with the community. I've seen people, for example, take field trips just around the neighborhood and really get a sense of, where they eat, how they live, who they're hanging out with. There's conversations that they have with teachers who've been there for more than 5, 6 years. They like to have conversations with the custodial staff or with the kitchen staff, and really get a sense of, how the school culture also is, right? Because you have a school culture, and you have the surrounding culture around that school, and getting a sense of where you're situated is really a strong point for a lot of, especially for teachers who are not from that community or don't have a similar community that they come from. It can be really astonishing and eye-opening for a lot of teachers. But if they get in there and really immerse themselves in the culture, it becomes a win-win for everybody.
Definitely. And I just want to touch on something. I know that you've founded this movement called Educolor, and I would love for you to talk more about that and tell maybe, if they're interested, how rising educators can get involved in it.
Well, the Educolor movement was started back in 2012 just as a venue for people of color to try to address issues of diversity within conferences. But then in 2014, we rebranded it as a space where we can both support and teach others about this idea of cultural competence through public school advocacy. So we consider ourselves public school advocates. One of the biggest ways that folks can get involved is obviously, picking up the Educolor hashtag on, it's just Educolor, hashtag Educolor on Twitter. Also, we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter page where you can subscribe to our updates fairly frequently. We have a newsletter as well that comes out once every 2 weeks, and we have a really popular chat that comes out once a month. It's usually the last week of the month. So there's plenty of ways to get involved, and at some point we're going to balloon to a point where we're going to have local chapters throughout North America.
Okay, very cool. And I just wanted to ask, I think, one more question. What would you say to future teachers who are about to start training to become teachers that they may not get through a traditional teacher program?
I think one of the big, it's a lot, right? And I don't want to disparage any one teacher program, because I think there are teacher ed programs that are trying new things nowadays. But I will say that one of the things that I learned how to do is do a lot of reading. Get out there and really go find out what the research is, and find out if there's any critical analyses of those texts. So, for instance, there are some teacher ed programs that like to use the text "Teach Like a Champion," and I'm someone who is against that methodology, mainly because of its militaristic attitudes towards children. So if you're going to pick up that book, then it's also good for you to get a counterbalance for what for that Teach Like a Champion is saying. Similarly, if you pick up anything by Ruby Payne, for example, who's written on, a framework on, a poverty pedagogy, if you will. I forgot what the term is that she uses, but you have to, again, look at it more critically and try to find critical texts that are also on the other side of that. Every time you pick up a text from somewhere, try to find the counterbalance to see what your opinion actually is, and go find real vetted research that can help you become a better teacher. Don't just rely on any one source.
All right.
That's great advice, Jose. One other thing that I just want to ask about in terms of advice for our rising educators comes from your Edutopia article, Empowering Educators Through Cultural Competence. And
Awesome.
the first line of that article, I'm just going to actually read it here. You say, the act of listening is perhaps the most underrated skill that there is in education. I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more. What do you mean when you say that listening is an underrated skill? Because I think that could be really relevant to our rising educators as they're thinking about how to develop their teaching skill set.
That's a great point. There's two parts to that. So generally in life, I try to do a lot more listening than actual speaking. I think I'm at a 40 to 60% clip now. I don't know why people want me to talk all the time, but I'm happy to do it nonetheless. I also noticed that as a teacher, if I'm doing more listening, that means that the students are doing more speaking, and that means the onus is on them to learn more. So if I'm doing a lot more listening and listening to the experiences of the students in the classroom, then I become a better teacher because I'm getting feedback from them informally and formally. I'm assessing them too, right? So if you have teachers who are just in the front of the classroom doing all the talking and doing all the thinking and trying to get students to think like them, then they're not really learning. Versus if you're doing more listening and asking questions and really being an active listener, actively listening, trying to piece together what's being said. And in many ways, you're going to have to also be able to take someone else's argument and regurgitate it and try to figure out what's really going on with that argument so you can deconstruct it and then hopefully come to a better understanding. I think that's what teachers ought to be doing all the time. So if you can do that actively, I think that's a big part of being culturally competent too. The idea that maybe our own experiences aren't the only experiences that are out there, and trying to become better listeners by coming to a better understanding of each other and how our relationship is going to be built.
All right, thank you. So we are going to move into the lightning round of questions. So these are going to be a little bit shorter and kind of a little bit more fun, hopefully. So my first one is, what is your jam right now? What song are you listening to?
My goodness. I guess I'll do okay, that one's a little more old school. I'll say
You can be old school. It's okay.
my goodness. I guess I'll put down Uptown Funk by Bruno Mars. That'll resonate with y'all. I mean, that's something that I listen to fairly frequently anyway. All right, and of course Justin Bieber, Where Have You Been? That's been one of my jams. I'm okay. I'm an adult now. Yes.
Ashley, what about you? Do you have a jam right now? Oh my gosh, I didn't know I was going to be part of the lightning round here.
Ta-da.
Yeah. What is my jam right now? I'm not going to lie, I love some Taylor Swift.
Well, I'm siding with Jose. I'm on the Justin Bieber track right now, and I just said that on the internet, but it's true. Okay, so who is one teacher you had that stands out in your mind?
Oh goodness, I'm thinking about my choir teacher, Mrs. Catani. Now, she wasn't an official teacher in terms of grading me, but she was the choir director, so she actually taught science, but I didn't get to have her as a science teacher. But I had her for choir, and I miss having my voice. That's first of all. I can't sing anymore for the life of me. It feels like I can do a mean karaoke, but that's about it. But back in those days, I mean, she was one of the few people who actually I felt like believed in my ability to raise my voice, and just those lessons were just amazing to me.
It's really powerful. All right, so what book are you reading right now?
I'm about to get into Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. Okay. So I won that book off of Ms. Gay herself, and I was like, oh yeah, I won. I was gonna buy it anyway off you, but I'll take it anyway.
What about you, Ashley? Ashley, are you reading anything right now?
I am. I'm actually reading Start With Why. It's a leadership and organization book. We're actually reading it as an office.
Oh, that's exciting. All of my reading is school reading, so I won't bore you with that. All right, and then what is the best piece of advice that you have ever gotten?
Wow. because I feel like I failed at almost all of it. I guess this idea of working twice as hard.
Mm.
That was one of the biggest advices I gotten, and I've noticed that there are those people who like kind of do it mediocre and you barely remember them, but there are people who are just remarkable and you kind of tell why because they really put in the work. And granted, that's not always going to work, but the people who I've met who've been remarkable are just incredible workers. So they've put in the work and they're going to have legacies that outlast. So in fact, that's the one big piece of advice: work twice as hard.
Yeah, I feel like that'll get you far. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jose Vilson. And please, everybody, remember to follow him on Twitter. With the handle is at the JLV, and check out his excellent blog, which I have been reading before this. It's thejosevilson.com, and please get involved with #Educolor. And that about wraps up this episode of EdRising Hangouts. Of course, please check out our lineup of upcoming events on the events page on educatorsrising.org, and always keep in touch on Twitter with the #EdRisingChat. Thank you both so much, and I'm Grace Worm. There is power in teaching.
Thanks.